Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We continue this series of episodes from presentations delivered at the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence Seminar on the Art of Teaching Mathematics. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence is an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offering seminars in classical academics and pedagogy for teachers nationwide of any background. Seminars are led by the faculty, leadership, and master teachers of Hillsdale College. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. To learn more, visit the webpage for the Hoogland Center by going to k12.hillsdale.edu. Click on the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center. Or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. In November 2023, Carrie O'Brien, classical pedagogy trainer for Hillsdale K-12, spoke to a gathering of teachers and school leaders about practical tips for teaching mathematics.
Good morning. Thank you all. Thank you. It's nice talking to teachers who respond to you. Thank you for joining me today to discuss some of the more practical elements of teaching mathematics. We'll get more philosophy later this afternoon or later this morning, but I want to spend some time this morning going over some practicals. Over the course of my teaching career, I've been able to teach mathematics courses from 5th grade up through teaching seniors in high school. And now in my role on the teacher support team with the Hillsdale K-12 Education Office, I have the great privilege of observing math classes from kindergarten up through 12th grade. So I hope today to share with you a few things I've picked up along the way from my own teaching experience and from the many teachers whose classrooms I've been able to be a part of, including there are some people in this room whose classrooms I've recently been in and have learned from. So I think before we get to the practicals or the how, we first need to briefly orient ourselves in the why. You'll see this as a theme throughout the talk. We need both the how and the why in mathematics in order for our students to really learn. So, why do we teach mathematics to our students? Is it simply for utility's sake, so that students can become functioning adults who can pay their bills and do their jobs? Or perhaps we teach it really just for those students who will go on to study mathematics and become engineers and accountants. If we teach math for those reasons, then I'm not sure this is going to be the most practical talk. We could, as Paul Lockhart laments in the book that you have received, we could just teach the particular skills and algorithms that students will need for those purposes. focusing our efforts on the highest students who will go on to study mathematics in college and beyond. But what if we, as teachers of mathematics, have a higher calling than teaching students processes for being able to function as an adult? What if we taught mathematics for the sake of learning mathematics? To see the order and harmony in the physical world written out in the language of mathematics. What if we taught math to help students order their minds such that they become ordered human beings? To connect students to the rich history of the human intellect that has unfolded over millennia. How would our teaching change if we wanted students to really understand mathematics rather than just do mathematics? In the classical schools that I have the privilege to work with, our aim in math class is not simply to repeat after the teacher, but rather to come to a deep understanding of the cohesive whole of mathematics. We are able to do the mathematics, but also we are able to articulate how we come to a conclusion that we come to, why we might choose a certain route to get there, and how one thing affects another. And so it is with this mindset that I offer a few practical tips for teaching mathematics, such that our students will come to understand both the how and the why of all they learn in math class. And perhaps some will fall deeply in love with it along the way. The 5 tips I have for you today are certainly not novel ideas, but I know some of the most helpful advice I have received as a teacher was to return to tried and true principles of teaching. Keep things simple, but sound. That might sound familiar, and you picked up Dr. Copeland's book out on the table. If you haven't picked that up yet, make sure that you get that. And so while these are not novel ideas, they are common threads of excellent math classes from the kindergarten class up through the AP calculus or statistics class with seniors. The more I get to watch and coach teachers across all grade levels, the more I believe that what works for those kindergarten teachers will also work for the teacher of calculus. So, with that, let's get to the practicals. Tip number 1, teach through questioning. I know, Dr. Greg is giving a full talk on teaching math through questioning across the hall right now, and you've decided to attend the talk that wasn't about questioning. But I argue that good questions, and many of them, is really the single best way to teach mathematics, such that students will gain both procedural knowledge and conceptual understanding. Many of us in this room may have even learned math in a sort of drill and kill style, where the teacher tells the students how to do the processes, then the students proceed to repeat the process until it is fully solidified in their mind what they must do when they see a problem of this type. If a student comes up with his own way of working through a problem, he might receive a response from his teacher that ends up sounding something like, "You can't do it that way because in this classroom, it's my way or the highway," right? This is a sure way to kill the joy of learning mathematics or of inspiring students to do their own mathematical thinking beyond what we can teach them in the short amount of time we have them. Along with potentially killing all joy in the subject, if we treat math as a set of rules to memorize and apply, we will also run the risk of students coming to see mathematics as an arbitrary set of rules, perhaps created by teachers as a cruel punishment that all must endure for their years in K-12 education. Or perhaps young people will see mathematics simply as a way of getting things done, rather than as a progression from wonder to exploration to problem solving to generalization. So how do we keep math from becoming a set of rules for rote memorization? I suggest we invite students into this mathematical process of wonder, exploration, problem solving, generalization, by asking them to think through our questioning. We must turn our students to the truth rather than simply telling them the truth. And we allow them to see the order that is innate in the mathematics and in nature. So, what types of questions ought we to ask in a math class? I like to break these questions up into two categories: procedural questions and conceptual questions. Procedural questions are more surface level. They mostly get at the how. What do I need before I can add these fractions together? What does the cubed mean in 5 cubed? What steps should I take next in this long division algorithm problem? Subtraction is the same as addition of the what? How do I isolate x in 5x equals 20? And so on. These are questions that most often occur while doing a calculation together as a class. These procedural or factual questions are especially helpful for the teacher to know if her students are following along with her. And they are great for students as they get to practice the facts that they really do need to memorize. If you are not in the habit of asking students questions during math class, procedural questions are a great place to start. Try to not work out a single step of a problem without asking students what to do and what the correct calculations are. We can do that asking really only procedural questions, but it can be quite difficult. So build up your question asking muscle, and not only will those procedural questions become second nature, but also you will naturally want to ask the second type of question, which is the conceptual question. Conceptual questions get at the heart of, the concept. These are the questions that ask why. How do you know? What would happen if I changed something here? Or, is this always true? This is where the real magic of learning mathematics happens, where students begin to make logical connections, recognize patterns, and put the procedures in their proper context. These questions might occur at the beginning of a lesson or before tackling a new problem. What do you think the result will be close to? Let's make a prediction. How is this problem similar to ones we have seen before? How is it different? How does that difference affect how we're going to approach the problem? Or one I often use with my middle schoolers, which this question tended to most often occur when fractions appeared. What don't you like about this problem? That's probably where we're going to start. Conceptual questions might occur once you have completed the problem as well. Did we discover a pattern here? Did anyone solve it differently? Which strategy or method was more efficient? Which strategy was more elegant? How can we know for sure our answer is correct? If I change this one element, what effect does it have on the problem and how we approach it? Will this method always work? How do you know? We know that math builds upon itself, so why not let it build seamlessly by making connections in this way? Sometimes the best conceptual questions occur not at the beginning or at the end of working through a problem, but in the midst. These moments most often come in the form of two simple follow-up questions. Why? And how do you know? Paul Lockhart defines mathematics as the art of explanation. And it is through these questions, why, how do you know, as well as those already mentioned, that we get our students to explain what they are doing. We have all experienced moments of thinking we have understood something that was just explained to us, then realizing as we repeat it back that we still are not quite sure. On the contrary, we think we don't quite have something, but in the act of explaining it to someone else or simply out loud to oneself, we make those vital connections that make it all click. When students would come to my desk for help during study hall, I always referred to my desk as the magic desk, because everything suddenly became clear when students came to my desk for help. But the real magic, of course, which I always explained to them, was not in being at some magical desk, but in actually speaking out loud their thoughts and their attempts. So again, how do we get our students to explain, either out loud or perhaps in written form, why they have made a certain mathematical decision? Well, we simply ask them, why? Why did you do that? What was the purpose of this step? How do you know that is correct? One of the best bonuses of asking questions like this is simply that your math class will become a rich conversation between you and your students. And it will become so much more enjoyable than if you just tell them how to do the math. So I'll end this tip with a quote and a challenge. First, a quote from The Lament of Paul Lockhart, which I have already mentioned and which you should read because you've received that copy. He says, "By concentrating on what and leaving out why, mathematics is reduced to an empty shell. The art is not in the truth, but in the explanation, the argument. It is the argument itself which gives the truth its context and determines what is really being said and meant. Mathematics is the art of explanation. If you deny students the opportunity to engage in this activity, to pose their own problems, make their own conjectures and discoveries, to be wrong, to be creatively frustrated, to have an inspiration, to cobble together their own explanations and proofs, then you deny them mathematics itself." So, now I have a questioning challenge for you. Truly attempt to teach a whole problem, concept, or even a class through questioning. This will force you to ask the follow-up questions that will both enrich the class conversation and enforce your students' conceptual understanding and willingness to problem solve. Okay, this leads us well to tip number 2. Engage the whole class. How do we engage the whole class? I have a few suggestions, which perhaps not surprisingly center around great questions. I led these 5 tips with questioning for a reason. The rest of these tips won't work unless you ask really good questions. So one of the best ways to engage the entire class to reach every student is to use a variety of questions all throughout the lesson, coupled with a variety of required response types. Notice the word I just used there. Required. If you want to engage your students, require them to engage and set them up for success to do so. I think it is important to first recognize that it is an easy temptation to fall into, to ask for volunteers and then to only call on the brightest students. They're generally the most eager and the first to have their hands up. It certainly makes our job easier if our goal is to simply cover the material. But covering is not the same as teaching. And if we simply cover the material, how do we know that every student in our class has really learned? How do we ensure that we engage the high students, the low students, and everyone in between? I recommend first putting a mini whiteboard in front of each student. Put the textbooks and notebooks away and ask them to write. This allows you to check in with each and every student in an efficient, low-stakes way. And you can make a quick judgment call of who you might actually call on to speak based on their whiteboard responses. You suddenly have complete control over the conversation that is about to ensue. You don't have to keep the responses on the whiteboard between you and the students. Ask students to share their answer with someone next to them, to engage in this art of explanation by discussing with a friend. This should be brief, but it gets everyone practicing this art of explanation, and the students will actually help hold each other accountable as long as you've created this environment in your classroom where we're all working and working together. This will also make cold calling less daunting to the students because they've already had the opportunity to attempt an answer and explanation in more of a one-on-one setting than in front of the entire class. We should cold call in our classes. There ought to be an expectation that any student can be called on at any moment. And if a student doesn't know the answer, they should know that they are not off the hook. At the very least, we return to that student once we have found the answer. But it is our responsibility as the teacher to find some bit of truth in what they have to say, to bridge where they are coming from to where we know they need to go by asking simpler questions first. I want to give you two other ways to engage all students, both of which are, I think, often overlooked. The first is often missed, especially by our middle and high school teachers, of which I was one. You should frequently use choral response in your class to keep your students alert, engaged, and thinking. This helps them to stay with you, but it also gives you quick insight as to whether or not they are following the idea and are simply following along. Everyone in a pre-algebra class should be able to tell me that 5 times 4 is 20. If only 10 of my 25 students have responded with 20 when I say 5 times 4 is what? Big serious. I know that I do not have them engaged in my classroom. So use choral response for your sake, but also to keep the students engaged. We know that the more that they talk, the more alert and awake they are with us. This idea only works, though, if you require all of your students to participate and have a set procedure and expectation for how this will look. I think the second overlooked idea is to engage all students by having them write. And I mean in sentences in math class. This will especially push your brighter students who often struggle to articulate their thinking. They're the ones who just know how to do it naturally. You say, "How did you know?" "I don't know. I just did know." Right? So let's push them by getting them to write. We should, on occasion, have all students write out their explanations. My students knew they would always have to justify their answer in written form on at least a couple problems on every test. But you might also have a student who finishes a practice problem in class long before his peers. And so a great way to stretch that student is to ask them to write an explanation of what they just did. If your students are at the point of writing complete sentences, get them to write. If you're in the kindergarten, first grade classroom and they're not quite at complete sentences yet, have them talk, right? We can have them talk. We can have them show their thinking with manipulatives, but we want to get them writing. So here's your second challenge. When you go back into your classroom, think about whether each and every student is engaged in the class. Not just your brightest students, but every student. A few simple adjustments to how students respond to questions can make a world of difference. So, tip number 3 leads us into the realm of how our students best learn mathematics, though it is also another great way to keep students engaged during class. So, tip number 3 is to teach with concrete manipulatives or pictorial visual representations as often as possible. This is another one I think we sometimes forget about in the middle and high school grades, especially the concrete manipulatives. But these tools are just as powerful in the upper level courses as they are in our youngest grades. So I'm going to start here with an example from my pre-algebra classes. So I want you to imagine a triangular prism. And this is something that I've learned from Nikki Teeple, who's going to be talking about math games later this afternoon. The more we can get our students to visualize in their minds before we give them the visual or the concrete object, the better. So, can you see a triangular prism in your mind? I see a tent, classic tent, or a straight edge wedge of cheese. That's what I visualize. If you're not visualizing anything, maybe you've forgotten what a triangular prism is, and that's okay. So as a reminder, a prism is a 3-dimensional object with 2 bases that are the same and parallel. Thus, the prism maintains the shape of the base all throughout the object. So when I'm teaching this to my 7th graders, I could begin by giving them that definition. And then I could say, okay, boys and girls, that's a prism. We're going to learn about triangular prisms today. A triangular prism has 2 bases that are triangles. We can find the volume of a triangular prism by first finding the area of the triangular base by multiplying 1/2 of the triangle's base times its height. And then we multiply that by the height of the prism. And I'm saying that with a smile on my face, and I'm excited. But who cares? Right? So what I do instead, and let me say this, I require my students to have that formula memorized. But it doesn't come first. So what I do instead is I bring in a loaf of bread. It is not a triangular prism, and it's not a perfect prism, but it gets the idea across. And we look at this piece of bread, and I simply ask a question along the lines of, if I wanted to know how much bread there is in this loaf of bread, how could I describe that, and how could I find that? And they might say, well, you have a loaf of bread there, and it has 12 slices. So you have 12 slices of bread. And that's a quantity. That gives me an amount, and we can go from there. And actually, what a great way to get started, because what I really want my students to do is I want them to visualize a prism that is made up of a bunch of slices. And so then we start talking about the difference between the soft, fluffy stuff and the smooth crust around that slice of bread. And all of a sudden, we're starting to dig in, right? What's true about each slice? Now, this is where things, don't carry over perfectly to our perfect three-dimensional object, because we know that the end slices are going to be a little bit different. But isn't that so crucial, especially when it comes to finding the surface area of the prism? Oh, this crust really is just the surface area. That fluffy stuff in the middle represents the volume of bread that we have. Can we find the volume of the fluffy stuff in one slice? Yeah. If we know what the volume is in that one slice, and we know how many slices there are, could we calculate the volume of the entire loaf of bread? Absolutely. And so all of a sudden, our students start to see, oh, a prism is something. It means something. And so there's a relationship between a triangular prism and a rectangular prism, and a prism with any kind of base. And, oh, actually a cylinder works the same exact way. We just have a circular base now. And when the students come to this idea on their own, through our guidance, they're bought in. This is their math. It's not my math. Right? I am not the math god on high telling them what they are to do and how this works. That is not me. Our students are able to come to this understanding, and then if they have that particular understanding, they can apply it to all sorts of things. If I start with the formula, they can only apply that formula to the same exact type of problem. It's backwards. So, let's try to put either concrete representations, physical representations in front of our students, or a visual representation. This isn't just good teaching, too. This is research-based, and one of the best researchers, I think, really found a missing link. That researcher is Jerome Bruner, and he studied the phases of intellectual development and found that students learn best when a careful progression of the concrete to the pictorial to the abstract occurs. Oftentimes, I think it's this middle piece, the pictorial, that we miss. So in the schools that are affiliated with Hillsdale College, and Dr. Gregg mentioned this last night if you were here, our elementary grades use the Singapore math curriculum. And it's based on this research that we learned from the concrete to the pictorial to the abstract. If you have the opportunity sometime soon, look it up and do some research. It's incredible what, for instance, a third grader can do. They can solve a problem that my students in an Algebra 1 class would solve using equations by simply drawing a pictorial representation. In this particular curriculum, they focus on the bar model. I was in Mrs. McEver's class on Tuesday, and they were working on a bar model problem, a word problem that was fairly complex. And a student raised his hand and he said, I was so confused and didn't know what was going on. And then I drew a bar model. And it all made sense. And it was just this lovely moment of a student coming to understand the problem, but also feeling deeply confident in his ability to approach that problem. So if we give students concrete manipulatives and then move them into pictures, which are more abstract than a concrete object, then they'll be ready to move into the abstraction of numerals and arithmetic, and finally algebra and calculus. I have a question for you. Do you think that it's cheating to use a manipulative on a test? I don't. That's where your students are in this kind of progression of learning, then that's the tool that they need. In algebra and beyond, we should be very used to using pictorial representations in the sense of graphing on the Cartesian plane. But how can we make something concrete in algebra? There are many actual physical manipulatives that you can use. But I also would remind you here that oftentimes the best concrete objects we can use in algebra is just a table of ordered pairs of numbers. So once we move into this abstract realm, what becomes concrete are the numbers themselves. Let's find the relationships between the numbers, look for patterns, and then we can abstract the idea. So anytime you can get students' hands on something concrete, do it. Their mathematical understanding will be the better for it. So your challenge here for tip number 3 is to incorporate either a manipulative or a visual in each of your math classes. So this leads us to tip number 4. We should encourage our students to use mental math and strengthen their number sense in every class. Good news, much of this comes from the use of visuals, such as number bonds. But it also requires you as the teacher to be always on the lookout for mental math opportunities. So maybe we're working on long division. Well, maybe we've learned the long division algorithm, and we're doing a problem that requires some division, perhaps something like 550 divided by 4. Does a 4th or a 5th grader have to use the long division algorithm to do 550 divided by 4? No. Do they often instinctually want to just jump to that algorithm? Yes. So we have to encourage them to try using mental math. Something like changing 3/20ths into a percentage. I saw this recently in a class. The students wanted to divide 3 by 20 to turn it into a decimal. That's what they were practicing. I don't want to do 3 divided by 20. Do you? No. What do we know about fractions? And what do we know about percentages? And what do we know about the relationship between 20 and 100? Can we do this in our heads? Yes. Do we as the teacher have to encourage this? Yes. Mental math really is just manipulation. It's seeing something from a different perspective and thinking for just a moment about the best path to take. And isn't that something that we want our students to be able to do in general and as human beings? To stop and think about the decision they're about to make. What a great opportunity for them to do this in a simple way. Again, this is not just for the elementary grades. I think sometimes we have to encourage our older students even more than our younger students so that they don't lose their mental math abilities. So how do we build mental math abilities in our classrooms? One of the best ways is through games, and I will leave that topic to Nikki People this afternoon. But during the lesson, you can also implement this by asking students, again, to explain their thinking. Look for opportunities for students to do this. Ask a higher student how they did a calculation so quickly. The act of explaining that calculation will stretch the higher student, but it also allows everyone else to hear a strategy that their peer used. And we all know that so often our students will say, why didn't I think of that? Right? And now they have another tool in their mathematics toolbox. One simple thing to do to encourage more mental math is to present arithmetic problems to students horizontally. If you're familiar with Singapore math, most of their problems are first presented horizontally. And this is to help stop that instinct to jump to the algorithm. So if we present, for instance, a multiplication problem already stacked vertically for the students, what do they want to do? Jump to the algorithm. So if we present it horizontally, just that one little change can make a big difference in getting them to slow down and think about, what route should I take here? Can I do this in my head? So challenge number 4 should be fairly straightforward here. Ask your students to work out calculations in their heads, but then also have them verbalize what those strategies are. Okay, tip number 5 perhaps brings all of this together. Tip number 5 is encourage creative problem solving in your class. As we discussed previously, math class ought not to be my way or the highway. If you were here last night, you heard Dr. Gregg discuss how we ought to view mathematics with a mindset of we are teaching absolute truth, but we are teaching these truths to human beings. Mathematics is truly a human endeavor, and in encouraging creative problem solving, we recognize the humanity of our students while also bringing them into the great history of the human intellect. That's quite the task that we have. So, how do we encourage creative problem solving? I think the most important piece here is our responsibility as the teacher is to model for our students how to approach a problem. And we can do that by modeling for them the questions, there it is again, questions that they ought to ask themselves when they see a problem. So I like here to use George Polia's 4-step problem-solving series, I guess. It's quite simple, and honestly, it should be obvious to all of us as adults, especially as teachers. It's quite simple, but it's a helpful framework that we should lead our students to follow in problem solving. So step number 1 is understand the problem. What are we trying to find here? How is this similar or different from what I've seen before? Can I make a prediction about what the answer will be? These are the questions that we would ask our students to show them what it is that we're thinking about. So, step 1, understand the problem. Step 2, devise a plan. Can I draw a picture? Do I notice a pattern? What is the connection between the unknown and the given information? So, step 1, understand the problem. Step 2, devise a plan. Step 3, what do we do once we've devised a plan? We carry out the plan. What was the purpose of this step that I just took? If I can't articulate the purpose, should I have taken that step? How do I know I did that step correctly? So we've understood the problem, devised a plan, carried out the plan, but we know that's not the end. Step number 4 must be to check your solution. Does my answer make sense? Is it reasonable? Did my plan work? Will it always work? Sometimes we just glaze over what I think is the best part of working through a problem together as a class, and where some of the greatest opportunity for learning is, and that's at the end, once we've finished the problem. So again, these steps are simple. Understand the problem, devise a plan, carry out the plan, check the solution, of course. But we need all 4 of these to have a sound understanding of the problem at hand. The end of the problem is also a great time to then ask, did anyone do it differently? This is one of the best ways to encourage creativity in problem solving, which Dr. Gregg talked about last night. I was in a 1st grade class earlier this week where the students were working on simple 1-digit addition. There were at least 7 different strategies discussed in the span of about 8 to 10 minutes. So if we allow our students the opportunity to think, to get creative, and to spend time discussing why one strategy might work better here, while another strategy works better elsewhere, then our students will have the courage to try a problem they have not seen before. So challenge number 5. Ask your students the simple question, did anyone solve this differently? You'll be amazed by what your students are capable of And I think you'll find that though this can actually cause us to enter into a realm of the unknown, because our students might come up with something we hadn't thought of, I think you'll find your class to be far richer and your students far more engaged in the true conceptual understanding of the mathematics. Okay, we've made it through all 5 tips. Ask great questions, engage the whole class, encourage mental math and number sense, and encourage creative problem solving. By weaving these elements throughout each class, we invite students into the human story of mathematics. I'll end with a quote from Francis Sue's recent book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing. He says, "To do mathematics means more than just learning the facts of mathematics. It means seeing oneself as a capable mathematical learner who has the confidence and the habits of mind to tackle new problems."
That was Carrie O'Brien, classical pedagogy trainer for Hillsdale K-12, and her lecture, Practical Tips for Teaching Mathematics, from November 2023. To learn more about the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, visit the webpage at k12.hillsdale.edu. Click the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.